Neighborhood History channel and our weekly Q&A, Ask Me Anything history related. This is Friendly Neighborhood History, and after 6 months, we are still going at it, still doing what we can, daily content uploading all the time, and it is my pleasure to bring to you the next hour talking about some historical topics and answering any questions you may have history related. I've got a few topics on my mind that I would like to discuss with you, but more important than that, I also want to hear your questions, anything you want to talk about, history related, social science related. I am ready to discuss it with you. Of course, as usual, I've got some topics on my mind that I want to bring up, but the main reason for doing this is to hear from the channel and to grow the channel, and it has been very successful. We've had some really great discussions. Last week we talked about a lot of great things, and so if you've joined, make sure to like, subscribe. It'd be really great to see you and hear from you, and talk about the channel a little bit, but also talk about what I like to talk about, social sciences and history. I am a historian, and I like to bring history to you in a friendly neighborhood way. That is why the channel is Friendly Neighborhood Historian, which of course I'm very worried will be eventually copyright. So I might need to change that because I don't want Marvel coming after me. The idea for the name of the channel obviously comes from the Friendly Neighborhood Spider-Man, my personal favorite superhero, although I'm starting to believe as I go around this world that some of the real heroes involve teachers. And so I am wearing my I teach high school what's your superpower t-shirt today, and I've worn that a couple of times on the live stream, so some fun stuff there. I've got a couple of nice objets I'd like to present to you. We've got a vase and a nice little bust and a globe. Nice to spin that around and kind of enjoy yourself there a little bit. So anyways, what do we want to talk about this week? So a couple of things historical that came to my mind that I'd like to discuss, that everyone likes to discuss, maybe the most important historical topic ever, and for some reason is trending a lot these days, and that is the fall of the Roman Empire. Obviously, a lot of people wonder why exactly the Roman Empire fell, and I've been studying it a lot on my channel as I'm doing my Roman Emperor series and getting closer and closer to the end of the Roman Empire. I'm starting to see some patterns about what actually caused the fall of the Roman Empire, and I'd like to discuss some of those patterns with you today. So, obviously, this is something that has troubled historians for a long time. It might be the biggest question in history, exactly why Rome fell and when did it fall. A lot of people think that the Roman Empire fell, excuse me. Okay, sorry about that. I had some background noise coming up, but welcome everybody. Thank you for joining. Be sure to like and subscribe. We're talking some history stuff. It's my weekly Q&A for the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. Thank you so much for subscribing. We are going to be talking about some history, and I was bringing up the fall of the Roman Empire, but anything you would like to talk about, any questions you have, be sure to drop them in the chat, and I will answer them as best as possible. I usually talk history and social sciences. Last week we talked politics a little bit. It was a lot of fun. Really, really enjoyed it. Thank you for coming, everybody. I really appreciate the attendance. But basically, a lot of people wonder why the Roman Empire fell. You'll excuse the phone in the back. A lot of people wonder why can we talk about Pearl Harbor? That's a great question. I really appreciate that. The Roman Empire fell for a number of different reasons. Nobody quite knows exactly, but studying it and looking at it more and more, one of the big things that I'm noticing is inflation and poor financial and fiscal policies ruining the Roman Empire. Yes, you can get a shout out. You just did. And anyways, so why the Roman Empire fell and where did it come from? Inflation is one of the biggest problems and one of the biggest causes. The Roman Empire basically decided that it wasn't going to handle its money appropriately anymore. There were two competing financial visions for the Roman Empire. Tiffany, you got your shout out you wanted. Anyways, so the Roman Empire fell for a multitude of reasons. Red, thank you. Next. But inflation is one of the biggest causes. And basically, there were two competing financial visions for the Roman Empire that emperors seemed to take. One was decreasing the value of silver and gold in the coinage. So if they minted silver or gold coins, they tried to use 100% silver or gold, but they found out that when their gold supply or silver supply got low, they could actually mint more coins and fund more armies and more wars if they actually devalued the currency by having copper, bronze, different alloys in there. So the silver purity would decrease and the gold purity would decrease, but the money supply would increase. And so having these more coins, emperors could buy more armies, they could build more buildings. But the problem was the value of all of these things decreased because it had less silver and less gold, stuff like that. Okay, thank you. Yes, those are too many names for me to say at once. But there's a lot of reasons why the Roman Empire had problems, but emperors seem to have kind of fallen in love with this idea of decreasing the value and the purity of different coinage and different types of money. And because they did that, the empire started to collapse because eventually the money became worthless because prices went up. And so the Romans could not handle the inflation crisis like they needed to. Anyways, so that was one of the reasons. Somebody asked about talking about Pearl. I don't know exactly if that's about when does the Q&A start. The Q&A is every week, Saturday, 6 p.m. Eastern. I'm doing a special for Labor Day. I will be here tomorrow at 3 p.m. Eastern as well. Would you say the U.S. is following down the same road? Yes, I would definitely follow that road. Belisarius or Justinian, both, because you can't have Belisarius without Justinian. And Justinian uses Belisarius to basically reconquer the fallen Western Roman Empire, and they got really close had not the bubonic plague struck and killed off a huge percentage of the Eastern Roman Empire, aka the Byzantines. So Belisarius relied on Justinian, and Justinian definitely relied on Belisarius. And definitely a lot of people have noticed that empires, when they're starting to collapse, their monetary supplies start to really struggle. So I would say, yes, the USA is falling down in many, many ways. The Goths won against the Romans. The Goths, like many barbarians, were actually being paid off by the Romans. So the Romans in like the 3rd and 4th centuries decided instead of fighting their enemies, they would buy out their enemies. So they would either pay for them not to attack or they would bribe them to be mercenaries. And part of the reason for this is that the Roman birth rates were decreasing. So you had fewer Romans, so you needed more fighting men. And so instead of fighting your enemy, the barbarians, you started to bribe them. And when your money started to devalue, they couldn't use the money that they were paid to buy what they wanted, and so they often rebelled against the Romans. So anyways, thank you for coming. Belisarius is a great general, no doubt about it. So the Goths and other tribes turn against the Romans because the Romans don't pay them. In fact, Alaric and the Goths, who sack Rome in 410, Goths as in barbarians, not Goths as in black nails and stuff like that, but the Goths that sack Rome in 410, I think that'd be a great meme, by the way. But the Goths that sack Rome in 410 are sacking Rome because they're looking for food and a warm place to stay, and the Romans haven't paid them, so they get back at them, and then they go down the Italian coast looking for more food until Alaric dies and the Goths kind of fall apart. So somebody asked about Pearl Harbor. Definitely a huge event in human history. One of the big, Napoleon's up there too, one of the greatest generals. In fact, in my opinion, Napoleon's got to take the cake as the first. What's my specialty when it comes to history? I try to specialize in any history I'm learning about at the current moment. I appreciate the person that just gave a like. Liking and subscribing helps a lot, helps get the word out, and keeps these live streams in this channel going. Thank you for asking about Pearl Harbor. My specialty is European history. Definitely, I've studied that more than any type of history, especially in the modern era, 19th and 20th century. But who is Hitler? I think you know it. I think we all know. But when it comes to Pearl Harbor, basically, the United States put an oil embargo on Japan for its aggressive activities and humanitarian violations in China. This is also a surreptitious way to help the British because they know that the Japanese have intentions to take over not just the French colonies in Southeast Asia during World War II, but also British colonies. The Japanese, something we don't talk a lot about in World War II, is two things. Japan was fighting with China. It's called the Second Sino-Japanese War. And they were also attacking India and Southeastern Asia and tried to attack Australia. And they were trying to get to all the British colonies that they could. And that happens after Pearl Harbor, but their aggressiveness makes the U.S. embargo oil supplies. Yes, I do. And they basically stop selling oil to them. And because of this, Japan retaliates by striking at Pearl Harbor. It's a huge victory for them. It's chaotic for the United States, who's not prepared for this, even though they've already been developing their military slowly but surely over the last couple years. And Yamamoto, the Japanese naval commander and probably their best military leader during World War II, says, "I fear we have awoken a sleeping giant, that the United States is not just going to lay dormant. They can be really dangerous." And it turned out that he was correct. So Pearl Harbor brings the United States into World War II. For some strange reason, after Pearl Harbor, Hitler declares war on the United States. He didn't have to do this, but he obviously is tired of the U.S. Kind of subtly helping the British, and he knows that the war is going to extend to the United States. And there are rumors that Hitler had an invasion strategy for the United States or a way to attack the United States. Yeah, medieval history, Renaissance history, there's a lot of great stuff going on there. Really, really enjoy that. And I could talk about that for a long, long time. Yeah, I mean, such a fascinating period of development. A lot of people call it the Dark Ages or just the Middle Ages, as if it's boring and not important between the fall of the Roman Empire and the rise of the Renaissance. But it's really an amazing time in human history. You've got a lot going on in China. You have a lot going on in the Middle East. And even as much as it's a stereotype that it's a really dark period, there's a lot of light in Europe at that time. The Dark Ages is probably a historical myth. I actually do daily historical myth videos on the channel and have covered the Dark Ages as one of my videos. So, India has an interesting role. So basically, what makes World War I and World War II world wars, and I would argue there's actually a third world war that we haven't talked about in history that would be the original OG World War. But India basically, because the European powers are at war, their colonies are also at war. So because Britain is at war during World War I and World War II, its African colonies are at war, and so is India. Because Germany is at war in World War I, its African colonies are also at war. And one of the consequences the Germans receive for losing World War I is that their colonies in Africa actually are taken away from them and split between the British and the French. The French, their colonies, same thing. And a lot of these colonies see the brutality of the war between the Europeans, and they think that they're civilized. They're not. We deserve our freedom. So the wars in World War I, yes, I do know what tarot cards are. Stop spamming that. Anyways, so India and the other colonies get involved. They help their sides, particularly the British and the French, but then they say, look at all of this brutality. We need our rights. We need our independence. And so they're huge, huge parts in conduits in getting them their freedom. India becomes free from the British right after World War II, and Ho Chi Minh actually declares Vietnamese independence right as World War II is ending in Indochina. Interestingly enough, Indochina, which is Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos, had been taken over by the Japanese in the early part of World War II after France gets knocked out of the war. And it's that aggression that leads the U.S. to put the oil embargo on the Japanese, which causes Pearl Harbor. So history is all connected. That's something I really love about it. You can draw a lot of lines and connections. So I hope that answers your question about India and their involvement. It's a colony being involved, and you have colonies in Africa, you have colonies in Asia, and you have Australia, you have colonies in South America. They're all going to get involved, so you're going to have a world war. And I wouldn't consider this the First World War, the Second World War, because the French-Indian War or the 7 Years' War involved fighting in North America, Europe, and India, and parts of Africa. So how is that not a world war? That's basically in the 1750s. Prussia and England fight against France, Russia and Austria on the continent. In India, there's fighting between the French and the British. I just did a video today on Clive of India and how he helped India be taken over by the British. And of course, the Americans are fighting with the British against the Indians and the French. It's called the French-Indian War, and it's how the United States gets it's how Britain gets Canada, and the United States, the colonies, get the Ohio River Valley, which is the Midwestern states, Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, places like that. World War II definitely was weird. What game is this? I don't know what game it is. This is just me answering questions. When you consider how much the world was advanced with their weapon, what do you think would happen? I think that modern technology has been a way to keep people from going to war and causing more world wars. So for me, it would be a World War IV, just by my historical definition. The French-Indian War, the 7 Years' War, that's a world war. So that's World War I. Then the Great War is World War II. And then the one we all know is World War III, the most recent one. No, I didn't. You did. Projection much? Anyways, so modern technology, particularly nuclear bombs, has actually deterred a lot of people from going to war because those can be used to destroy hundreds of thousands of lives in a short amount of time. So tactical nuclear missiles, things like that could really, really destroy civilization. So we have the power at our fingertips to do a bunch of research and search up all of this historical information just in like 5 minutes. But we also have the ability to kill millions of people with that same technology. So it's pretty crazy. It would be trillionaires shooting armies. I'm not sure what you mean by that. It could be, yeah. The armies are getting bigger. Well, actually, armies are getting smaller, but our technology is getting more devastating. Trump or Kamala. I try not to keep my political opinions out there. I do talk about political strategy. I talked about it on the channel last week, and every Friday I drop political videos about what happened. There was a lot that happened this week with Trump going to Arlington, Kamala doing her first interview, the whole debacle about whether they would debate or not. So I talked about that in my channel. Yeah. What's wrong with this guy? There's a lot wrong with me, but none of your solutions seem to work. Yeah, so there's Arlington National Cemetery. So Arlington National Cemetery is actually was established by Congress in the 1860s during the Civil War, as a way to bury the many dead who had died during the Civil War. And interestingly enough, my first full-length video on the channel talked about this, but Memorial Day was created as a way to. It was called. I'm trying to remember what it was called. It wasn't called Memorial Day at first. Was it called Pageant Day or something like that? Flower Day? It was a way to commemorate those who lost their lives in the Civil War, particularly on the Union side. And the Confederate States started to practice it too after the war ended. And the National Cemetery Act created Arlington National Cemetery in the 1860s. And that has become the main cemetery for the fallen. And former President Trump visited it this week with no small controversy, commemorating the loss of 13 American soldiers when America pulled out of Afghanistan 3 years ago, which has been considered by many to be a debacle for the Biden administration when these 13 soldiers died. And a lot of people saw it as nothing more than a photo op and Trump standing on the graves of these soldiers. More importantly, people from his campaign team that supposedly were filming the event, which they weren't supposed to do, and an Army staffer tried to stop them, and they got into a verbal and then physical altercation. So it was pretty shameful. And so it kind of has backfired and hit Trump kind of hard there. He has his own story and version of events where he says that they were perfectly okay in what they were doing, and obviously has pointed out that neither Biden nor Harris were present. So that's what's going on there. So big controversy there. I talked about it a lot on the channel. I try not to give my political opinion. I try to talk what's actually the facts, because I'm a historian. And believe it or not, as modern and contemporary as this is part of American history and part of world history. So anyways, English or Spanish? Both. Thanks for what's your point? Well, my point is to tell the truth. When it comes to history, that's the job of the historian. The historian tells the truth. So that's the point I'm trying to go for, and hopefully I have presented that point. I'm not trying to get anyone to vote any particular way. I am offering information. I do try to do some strategy and talk about how this will hurt or help the candidates or stuff like that. I've seen these on YouTube. They're really cool. The election map predictions. Those seem to be a lot of fun. So I might do one of those when we get up close to the election from kind of a more historical perspective. Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you can film there, but you can't have a campaign event, and that's what they were accused of doing. They were accused of turning it into a campaign event, which was seen as, and Trump doing a photo op where he's kind of smiling with a thumbs up. To be fair to him, he was asked to go there by the families of the fallen, and of course he pointed out the absence of the president, who was on vacation in Delaware, which a lot of people have raised a lot of questions about that. And the absence from the president in media appearances since he decided he wasn't going to run anymore in July, kind of suddenly decided that. So Trump pointed that out fairly, but at the same time taking a photo op with his thumbs up, smiling, that didn't look good, and then the altercation really doesn't look good. So anyways, the movie, they filmed Hacksaw Ridge there? I know they filmed certain movie things there. I think it's because it was a campaign event and people were trying to make it a campaign event. And the photo op already was, a lot of people were saying that he was just using the death of these soldiers to his own political advantage. Of course, his response to that is basically what he is known for, swinging back at his opposition and saying, well, it's really everyone else's fault. So That's just a quick political thing. The thing was supposed to help him from a strategic perspective. I don't think it helped him at all, and it looked kind of bad. Yeah, I'll try to change them later. But thank you for the reminder. It's always helpful. Let's see. In the beginning, they showed it. Interesting. Yeah, I still have to. Have I seen that one? I might have seen bits and pieces of it. So, anyways, I really appreciate everyone's questions and stuff like that. Yeah, thank you. Thank you. That very good quote from Socrates. I know one thing above all, and that is that I know nothing, which is kind of a paradox and a contradiction, but whatever. So thank you all for liking. Be sure to give a channel a subscription if you enjoy this kind of content. I'm trying to grow the channel, get my content out there. If you have any questions, anything related to history, social studies, you feel free to drop a question in or a topic in the chat, and I will talk about it with you. I'm going to be here until 4, and then tomorrow for a Labor Day special, because people were asking about this last week. I am doing my second live stream back to back. First time I'm doing that. Tomorrow at 3 Eastern, noon Pacific. So please come to that too. It'd be great to see you on this wonderful Labor Day weekend. I thank you. I really appreciate that. Relatively. Okay. Thank you. I'll take relatively. Relative to who is the whole question, the whole point. Anyways, I'm trying to see if I had missed anything there. Somebody brought up the Palestine issue. Every week I get at least one person saying they love Israel and one person saying free Palestine. I'm glad you're learning things. I really appreciate that. It's just a common thing. People are going to bring up the Israel-Palestine thing, the Trump-Kamala thing. I have addressed it many times on the channel, and where I stand, I try to keep my opinions as close to the historical knowledge as possible. So anyways, let's see here. Did I miss any questions, comments, concerns? What else did I want to talk about? So I was talking about the fall of the Roman Empire and how inflation and monetary crisis can cause that. And I think maybe a lot of you have seen the meme where it says, weak men create hard times create strong men create good times, and good times create weak men. A lot of people see that as the fall of the Roman Empire. Obviously, the leadership and the emperors really after the Pax Romana ended at the end of the 2nd century, the rulers really are on a steady decline, and you have some exceptions like Aurelian and Diocletian and Constantine, who are really strong and powerful emperors. But really, after Commodus comes to power, which today is his birthday, by the way, Commodus comes to power in 180 AD, Rome really starts to fall apart, and it just gets worse and worse. The devaluing of the currency really hurts. Paying off the barbarians instead of defeating them really hurts. Declining birth rates happen. The only group that is actually growing in Rome in the last couple of centuries is the most heavily persecuted group in Rome, and that's the Christian church. So by the time Constantine comes to power in the early 4th century, persecuting the Christian church has not worked because they still survive. The persecutions have been sporadic, but Diocletian had actually tried to destroy them. And Constantine decides, why destroy them when you can actually partner with them? So he legalizes Christianity and tries to end persecution. There's one more emperor named Julian the Apostate, that's what Christian historians call him later on, who tries to take Rome back to the worship of the gods, the old Greek and Roman gods. And the Roman gods are basically the Greek gods with Roman names. So stuff like Zeus becomes Jupiter. Aphrodite becomes Venus. And if those names sound familiar, yes, the planets are named after the Roman gods, who are just small rip-offs of the Greek gods. For instance, Hercules. We call him Hercules. It's Heracles. The Romans called him Hercules. So it's too soon to talk about the fall of Rome. I was bringing this up earlier. It just seems to be one of these big things that people really like to focus on, especially young men when it comes to history. And I mean, I find it fascinating and interesting as a historian, but it doesn't stand out to me as much as you might assume it does, being a young man interested in history, because the Roman Empire is like a real big thing. What's my favorite dinosaur? The T-Rex, you got to go with the king. By the way, speaking of the Romans, Rex, that's a Roman word, means king. Can you talk about D-Day? Yes, I'd be happy to talk about D-Day. Let me see if I missed anything here. Yeah. Okay. Can I talk about D-Day? Yes. So I've been talking about World War II. Basically, D-Day is how the Allies decide to reinvade Europe. Actually, it's the alternative. The original plan was to go through Italy to get to Germany, and it actually works at first. Patton and Montgomery are very successful in taking over Sicily. When they invade Italy, the Italians basically lose their will to fight. They overthrow Mussolini's fascist government. And basically, the Germans come in and say, oh, no, you don't. And they kind of have this stalemate fighting between the Germans and a puppet Italian government and the free Italians, the US, and the British. And so the fighting kind of stalls in Italy for a while. It's going to take a while for the US to push the Germans completely out of Italy. And so the alternative is an invasion of Normandy from the Allies. Now, Hitler and some of the Nazi high command believed that the Allies would land at Calais, which is the closest point between the English Channel and France. And it seemed like the obvious spot. But Dwight Eisenhower, the Allied commander, surprises everybody by deciding to land at Normandy Beach instead, and basically sets up a big decoy army led by Patton that the German reconnaissance shows to the Nazi high command and Hitler believes that the Allies are going to land at Calais. Some of his generals are saying, no, they're going to land at Normandy. And so this decoy army fools the Nazis, and then the Allies, especially the British, French, and the British, the Americans, and the Canadians. The French are still knocked out of the war. There's a French resistance going on led by Charles de Gaulle, but they're pretty much knocked out of the war. They land on the beach at Normandy. I'm trying to remember the ones. Omaha is obviously the most famous one. That's the American. Juno is the Canadian, or Sword is the Canadian. Sword is the British, and Juno is the Canadian. So they have these several beachheads that they carve out on June 6, 1944. And it's going to, they already had paratroopers and special forces and spies landing the night before. And it's going to take them several days to actually defeat the Germans there at Normandy, because the Germans are there. It's going to take them a month to retake all of Normandy. And then by September, they're going to be going into Paris and basically liberating France. And that's going to bring France in a small capacity back into the war. And at that time, Italy's kind of collapsing. And so they're going to push towards Germany at the end of the year. So D-Day is basically this huge moment when the Allies surprise the Germans, they trick them, and they land in France. And that's how the Allies are going to bring France back into the war and really start to push the Germans back. The war was already turning against the Germans. The Soviets are pushing in from the east, so the Germans are faced with this really two aggressive fronts by the Allies on the west and the Soviets on the east. So really powerful stuff. Yeah, World War II is really fascinating. Can I talk about the War of the Spanish Succession? I don't know a huge amount about it. I believe it's Louis XIV wanting to get involved, and I think he wanted to put his nephew on the throne of Spain. And like many things Louis XIV does, it costs a lot of money, and he's a very successful king when it comes to war, but this one doesn't work out as well. I think the British do really well. This is where the British Navy really earns its bones and proves it's the best in the world, because during the 1600s it had been the Dutch, but by this point the British are the most robust navy in the world, and they win big. And I think that's where they get Gibraltar, and that's the Rock of Gibraltar, and that's a huge huge sign of British naval brilliance for a long time. So I'm sorry it took a minute, but yeah, the War of Spanish Succession is really interesting, because throughout the 18th century, the Europeans continue to fight these wars over small bits of territory and dominance. And really, it's not until after Napoleon's defeat that the Europeans decide, we fought on the continent too long, even though they're going to keep fighting on the continent. Let's go to other continents and fight there, like Africa and India. And then at the beginning of the 20th century, they're like, well, screw that. Let's just fight over the whole damn world. And that's where we get, obviously, World War I, or as I like to call it, World War II. Anyways, yeah, Azerbaijan. I don't know what you want to know about Azerbaijan. I don't know a huge amount of it. With the Volkswagen. So the Volkswagen is very interesting. Obviously, it's a good car, but the Volkswagen is actually a Nazi idea. Volkswagen means the people's car, the Volkswagen. And it is a part of Hermann Goering. He is Hitler's economic genius. And I'm not saying that to praise the Nazis, because they're absolutely evil pieces of dog dung. But one thing that Goering does to ramp up the Nazi economy is basically refusing to pay war debt that they owed to the British and the French from World War I, and just basically drafting everybody to work in the factories, and to just produce things for the German people. And one of those things is the Volkswagen. These were part of what Goering called his 4-year plans. And the Volkswagen, they build a huge, giant highway system so that they can have people driving all around, just to revitalize the German culture and the German spirit. Everything the Nazis do isn't just economic and industrial. It is about promoting the master race, the Übermensch, all of that. And one of the most powerful things they do is designing a car for the people. And so that's what the Volkswagen is. So the Volkswagen has obviously become an international brand that's very popular, very likable, and very reliable. But its legacy is it was the Nazi car. You should be a history teacher. Thanks, kind of already there. Can you talk about the British burning down the White House in 1814 and eating? Yeah, that's a great story. So basically, the War of 1812 is the one war. Well, there's several wars Americans don't like to talk about, but that's one the Americans really don't like to talk about. Basically, for years, the French and the British, who were fighting because of Napoleon, were picking off American ships and stealing them and everything in them, including their sailors. It was called impressment. And the Americans under James Madison stand up to them and say, we're not going to do this anymore, and they go to war. They try to take over Canada, that fails miserably. They try to beat the British at sea, that fails miserably. The British actually invade and take back areas of America, like in Maine and Michigan and areas like that. And they eventually land in the Chesapeake Bay in 1814 and march on the capital. And Madison and his wife barely flee in time. And Dolly Madison saves the giant portrait of George Washington that we all know and love. And then the British show up, they have dinner in the White House, and then they burn the White House and the nation's capital. And so a couple of things that come out of that war for the Americans: Andrew Jackson defeats the British at the Battle of New Orleans, very famous battle there. That makes him an international hero and puts him on the historical map. And obviously the British are bombing Fort McHenry in the Chesapeake Bay around the same time. And a young lawyer in a ship far away sees the flag was still flying. That was Francis Scott Key, and he pens the Star-Spangled Banner. The words for the Star-Spangled Banner, because he didn't write the song, he wrote a poem that was later adapted into music. And so the War of 1812 is how the Americans, they don't do too well, obviously getting their capital burned, and the British kind of whip them. And then at the end of the war, they basically decide, okay, we'll leave you alone. We're not even really fighting Napoleon anymore. You go off and do your thing. We go off and do our thing. And it's going to take a few decades, but eventually the British and the Americans are going to start becoming allies. But yeah, it's a savage move for the British to burn the capital. And some people have called it the Second American Revolution. If it is the Second American Revolution, then America lost its freedoms. I don't like to call it that because I don't see America winning that war. Why are we here in this universe? Deep questions. Deep questions. Are you from the real side of the pillow? Okay. French culture is bon vivant. Yep, definitely. I love a lot of French stuff. Thank you. It didn't let you know? I appreciate you getting notified about when these drop, but I'm sorry I didn't do that. I posted these a couple days ago. French are good people. French. Someone's asking, what is the French Revolution? Which one? There have been so many French revolutions through history. It's not even funny, and most of them happened in the 19th century and at the end of the 18th century. I've talked about it a lot on the channel, but basically, the French helped the Americans win their War of Independence. Again, all history is connected. And that bankrupts them, and King Louis XVI, in order to raise funds to revitalize the French economy, calls together the First Estate, which is the nobles, the Second Estate, which is the church, although I might have those two mixed up, and the Third Estate, which represents businessmen, artisans, and farmers. And the Third Estate really wants more rights. They want individual liberties. They've been influenced by Enlightenment philosophers. And when he gets tired of them demanding more freedoms and not wanting to honor him as king, he locks them out of a meeting. It's called the Estates General. And so they go to a nearby tennis court and sign an oath that they will continue to meet until they have their freedoms met. And a few weeks later, they storm the Bastille, they get weapons, they free prisoners, and they turn the French army. Every revolution that is successful in human history involves turning the army of the government against the ruler. If the army is turned against the ruler, then the revolution will work. This was the case in Russia, and it was the case in France. And basically, they establish a French republic. They overthrow the king. Later on, they're going to kill him. And they create a new government based on what's called the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. And this new government basically will run France during the 1790s. And in order to keep the revolution going, it cruelly represses anyone who stands against it, leading to the Reign of Terror with the Committee of Public Safety and its leader, Maximilien Robespierre, who basically targets anyone who he thinks is an enemy of the revolution until he is considered an enemy of the revolution, targeted, shot, put on trial while he's bleeding out of his neck, and sentenced to death and guillotined. By the way, the guillotine was it was a quick, easy way that they would chop people's heads off. They did that to King Louis XVI, his wife Marie Antoinette, and a bunch of people they considered enemies of the revolution. And the revolution basically fizzles out with all of the violence, and eventually the French government is so weak it turns to its best general to lead them, and that's how Napoleon takes over France. Once again, Napoleon controls the military, just like the revolutionaries had before him, and the king had before the revolutionaries. So controlling the military and keeping them loyal is a huge way that governments prevent revolution. Anyways, I hope that gives you, that's basically the first French Revolution. There's going to be a lot. Let me see here. I'm going to catch up on some. What do you think about Hyundai? I don't know much about it. Do you think Japan deserved what they got after they bombed Pearl Harbor? What do you mean by deserve what they got? Do you mean the atom bombs? Because we can talk. Because it's not because of Pearl Harbor. I don't think anyone deserves atom bombs. I don't think anyone deserves Pearl Harbor. Obviously, something a lot of people don't know about a lot is Japan's war crimes during World War II. What's called the Rape of Nanjing, where they unceremoniously, I should say, raped the city of Nanjing, the women and the children, killing tens of thousands of people. The death marches of Bataan when they took over the Philippines from the United States during the middle of the war. Japan did a lot of horrendous things in the war. And I don't want to say it's karma. I don't want to say it's God paying people back. I don't want to say it's just desserts. I don't want to say any of that because I don't believe anyone in Nagasaki or Hiroshima really deserved that. But it's not like Japan had done nothing wrong and then all of a sudden was attacked by the poor Americans, by the cruel Americans. Anyways, let me see. History Nerds Unite. Thank you for that. Yes, a hurricane comes in and destroys the city a few hours later too right now. Okay, how long does the stream last? Come and go as you please. I'm just happy to have you here. Be sure to like the content and subscribe. I go for an hour. And if you want to catch up a little bit more tomorrow, I will be here at noon Pacific time, 3 Eastern. You look like white George Floyd. Thanks. How did the British colonize India? That's a really good question. Was just talking about it earlier with Robert Clive, but basically, the British don't colonize it directly. It's one of their trading companies called the British East India Company. And basically, over a couple of centuries, the 16 and 1700s especially, in competition with the Dutch and the French, the British East India Company influences different rajas and rulers in India to turn against each other and slowly but surely carve out more and more land, more and more influence, and more trade rights and money for themselves, until by the 1800s, it's very clear that the British India Company controls India. And then in the 1850s, after a group of Indians known as the Sepoys revolt, and they are put down by the East India Company, the British cancel the East India Company because of its cruelty to the Sepoys during their rebellion, and take over and make India a colony in the British Empire. That's a very, very quick way to say it. What's your favorite country solely based on history? So there's a lot of great countries. There's so much. Every country I learn about, I find more and more fascinating. I spent a lot of time this year learning about Afghanistan, and I'm just amazed with the history I find there. The country I've learned the most about is Russia. That's been kind of my field of expertise, Eastern European history, stuff like that. The origin of humanity. That's a long question and more one for archaeologists and cosmologists than I can answer as a historian. Yeah, that's a good question. What is the average length of a government, dynasty, or establishment? A lot of people have pointed out that really strong countries, really powerful empires, and some have said the United States is one of these, they last about 2.5 centuries. That's their window. The Roman Empire lasted almost 5 centuries, but it was obviously in decline severely for the last couple of centuries, with some exceptions. So it all depends on the people and their government and how strong their rulers are if it's an autocracy, and how virtuous and self-sacrificing their people are if they're more like a democracy or a republic. So it kind of varies. Yeah, I'm sorry I didn't notify you. I'm really glad you're here though. Who are your favorite history YouTubers? That's a great question. It all depends what I'm learning. History Matters is probably my all-time favorite. I love the sarcasm. I love the British wit. They are really, really good, and they've inspired me. Spectrum's really good. He has some really good lists about rulers that I've enjoyed. I'm actually using his. I've done videos where I name every single British king. I don't know every single French king, but I'm using his list to memorize them, so I can do a video where I name all the French rulers from like Charles Martel onwards. Tea Time with Lindsay, she talks about the royalty of Europe. She's really good. And Epimetheus. I think it's Epimetheus. Epimetheus has some really good, and he does like individual country documentaries on this really, really cool animated tapestry. So check those guys out. They are all very, very good. Let's see here. Every beep from your smoke alarm makes me lose. Okay, sorry about that. No, it's all right about India. Why is your name mayonnaise on a hot dog? Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Can you tell me about the Western Front? Western Front in which war? There are a lot of Western fronts. Obviously, both world wars, or maybe all three world wars, have had a Western Front. Obviously, most people, when they talk about that, are referring to the Great War or World War I, or as I call it, World War II. Basically, the Western Front is basically where you have a bunch of trench warfare going on, where you have thousands of men dying, running into no man's land where artillery is firing, heavy artillery, machine guns, barbed wire, poison gas is being used. Later on, tanks. You have a bunch of men running out in this area, not knowing what's going to happen to them, fighting and dying just to gain maybe 100 feet of land at a time. And that's World War I. Both sides pushing back and forth. The French and the British, and later the Americans, pushing back against the Germans and then being pushed back by the Germans. And this goes on for 4 brutal years. The Americans are able to help the British and the French kind of overwhelm the Germans and push them out of the trenches and kind of in-trench warfare. But they were probably very welcome to do that, as Germany, having knocked Russia out of the war, could kind of focus all its attention on the Western Front. So the Americans were a huge help there. Why do I call World War I World War II? I was just talking about this because I believe a 7 Years' War in the 1700s, which involved fighting in India, Africa, North America, and Europe, could be a world war. One of the reasons we consider World War I, and of course they didn't see it that way. They thought there would only be this one war. That's why they called it the Great War, is because you have colonies going to fight automatically. So Britain has its colonies like India and Australia and South Africa. All of them are going to go fight. The French have Southeastern Asia. The people from there are going to go fight. Germany has colonies in Africa. They're going to go fight. The Russians have this huge landmass that controls so much of Eastern Europe and Eurasia. They're going to go fight. So it's not just fighting, it's the colonies fighting. Do a flip. Not right now. It's one of those things where it doesn't seem worth it, and World War I in many ways is seen as not worth it, but it does change a lot in history. And for better or for worse, we kind of are where we are today because of World War I, or as I like to call it, World War II. I consider, like I said, I consider World War I to be the French-Indian War. That's what the Americans call it, because the French ally with a bunch of Native American tribes, except the Iroquois, who ally with the British, and they fight in Canada, and they called it the Western Frontier. Interesting, speaking of Western Front, but in what we call in the United States the Midwest, which isn't the Midwest of the country really, but places like Ohio and Illinois and places like that. That's the frontier. Yes, many fight for man rather than righteousness. That sums up World War I in many ways. You have European powers fighting with each other and for each other, and kind of a domino effect happening. So basically what happens for World War I to go on, Archduke Franz Ferdinand is the heir to the Austro-Hungarian throne. He's killed by a Serbian nationalist. Austria-Hungary demands Serbia repay them. They don't want to do that. Austria-Hungary goes to war with Serbia. That's the first domino. Russia promises to protect the Serbians. They go to war with Austria-Hungary. Now you've got 3 countries involved. Germany tells Austria-Hungary, if you go to war with Russia, we will help you. It's called the blank check. And so now you've got Germany helping the Austro-Hungarians against the Serbians and the Russians. France is allied with Russia, so they're automatically joined. So now Germany knows it has to fight both France and Russia. That's why they have this thing called the Schlieffen Plan. They will knock out France, then turn their attention to the Russians, who have a large army, but will take longer to mobilize. Russia is backwards and impoverished and really failing compared to Germany, France, and Great Britain especially, but Russia has a lot of men and a lot of land. And the Germans feel that by 1917, if they don't go to war with Russia, Russia will be unable to be defeated. So Germany thinks the Schlieffen Plan will work. So Germany, Austria-Hungary, Serbia, Russia, and France are now involved. And their colonies. Germany goes through Belgium to get to France. And Belgium was created at the end of the Napoleonic Wars so that the Europeans, so that the French and the Germans wouldn't fight each other on their own land. So when they go through, but Belgium was always supposed to be neutral and no one was really supposed to invade it. Britain promised to ensure Belgian neutrality. So when Germany does this, they're surprised to learn the British honor their agreement to protect the Belgians, and Great Britain joins the war. So you've got France and Great Britain in the west, Russia in the east, Austria-Hungary, and then a year later, Italy joins. So does the Ottoman Empire in Turkey. And now you've got every major empire in the world, except if you want to argue it's an empire, the United States is involved, and they're going to get involved later, because Germany's going to go around with their submarines, the U-boats, sinking as many ships as they can who they think are bringing supplies and weapons to the British and the French. And they're going to piss off a lot of countries. Brazil, Japan, China. Those are independent countries that get involved. That's not to mention all the colonies for all of these empires that are also fighting. There's fighting in Africa. There's fighting in Asia. There's fighting all around the world, and that's why most people consider it a World War, and World War I. So basically, the war happens because you have all these dominoes falling over. And really, in many ways, the last domino to fall over is the United States. They get involved in the war, and they help the Allies overwhelm the Germans in the West. The Germans are also suffering because of an English blockade that basically starves them. If that's a really great question about World War III. So a lot of people think that there is a possibility that the way the world is laid out right now, we could be on our way to World War III, or as I would call it, World War IV. Well, we could be. But the way it's actually laid out is more like World War I, the Great War. It's the one I just described, because you have a bunch of spheres of influence and alliances that people might have to offer. Israel fighting Hamas, that could bring in Iran. We don't know. I'm not saying it will. I'm not saying I want it. I'm not saying anything. I'm not giving an opinion. I'm giving a strategic perspective based on history. If Iran attacks Israel, the United States will probably be obligated to help Israel. Iran cannot take on the United States militarily, but they might, like Austria-Hungary couldn't take on the Russians, they might be getting a promise from someone else. Russia's obviously fighting in Ukraine. China has aspirations for Taiwan. North Korea is interested in attacking South Korea. The United States is telling Japan, interestingly enough, to mobilize a military. 80 years after the end of World War II, when the US occupied the archipelago and said to the Japanese, you can't have a military anymore. So one domino falls, then another domino falls, then another domino falls, then you could have World War III. So, and it could be far more bloody, far more costly, and far more devastating. And some people may think there are moral reasons for it. I just hope that the most moral reason is that it doesn't happen. Cooler heads prevail. Germany surrenders because they're basically starved because of the British blockade, because the Germans try to outdo the British Navy and they just can't. That's a great question, by the way. And basically the Allies get a lot of help from the U.S. and the Western Front. And the U.S. can mobilize very quickly. And the U.S. has been getting money from the British and the French, who've been loaning supplies from the Americans. So the Americans aren't damaged at all, really, by this war, other than, of course, their casualties. So the United States comes out on this war not devastated by environmentally and infrastructurally like Britain and France in these areas. They don't have as many casualties, and they don't have this huge traumatic war scar. They don't have their soldiers coming home with shell shock, at least not in the same way that the Germans, the French, and the British do. And that's what creates a group of people called the Lost Generation, a series of writers and artists and people who are kind of reflecting on life and saying, that war was really pointless and stupid. Why did everybody die? And that's what we see in the writings of people like Ernest Hemingway and William Faulkner, and some of the artists who come out in the 1920s. The Crimean War being a world war is interesting. You got a lot. I don't see as much in Africa. I can't quite call it a world war, but it's close. Most of the fighting is in the Black Sea too. It's not stretched out in different zones. But the Crimean War is very interesting. Russia thinking that Britain and France won't help the Ottoman Empire in the 1850s because the Ottomans are Muslim. Britain and France telling them that's not true and trying to keep Russia from getting too powerful. Basically, after Napoleon was kicked out of power, every European power agreed that they would try to keep each other from not getting too powerful on the continent. That doesn't mean they can't go to Africa and Asia and get a bunch of colonies like they do. But on the continent, they can't get too much land. And so Britain and France helped the Ottomans, their Muslim rivals, stop the Russians in the 1850s. It's a very interesting war, and we don't talk about it enough. Why did Roman provinces become different cultures and languages, countries, but China stayed with? Because really, although China's imperial dynasties have collapsed, I would say the answer to that is that China's imperial system lasted all the way until the modern world. The Roman imperial system did not. You have a cohesive Chinese imperial system that is kind of brought together. You have warring states, you have three kingdoms, but eventually you're going to get an empire. And there's this kind of devotion to the emperor and the Middle Kingdom. You got something right on your mouth, sorry. Assassination. Tomorrow's Pacific time, I start at 12. So 1 Mountain, 9 o'clock in Britain, France, places like that, 10 o'clock in Israel. I'm trying to get a tripod so I can put the phone down, but thank you. Would you fight in war if there is a draft again? I've often joked, if there's a draft again, you can see how fast I'll make it to Canada. Not sure. Everyone wants to talk a big game, but nobody actually knows. Thank you for bringing that. There's a lot of countries that fight in World War I that we don't know about. Bulgaria, Montenegro, Romania, they're all fighting around. They kind of get involved slowly but surely, and they're kind of just overwhelmed by the larger forces, either the Russians or the Germans. Why was Hungary punished so hard compared to Germany? Germany's punished the hardest after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles basically says Germany loses its empire, it has to accept blame for the war, and it has to pay back huge war debt, which the way the German government does this is by printing a lot of money and devaluing their currency, just like the Romans did. That inflation destroys them, just like it destroyed the Yuan dynasty, the Mongols in China, and just like it destroyed the Romans. The inflationary thing, we can circle back to it. But Hungary, basically, Austria-Hungary is divided up into a bunch of different countries that are hopefully relative to the different ethnic groups that made up the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So you have Croats, you have Slavic peoples, you have Serbs, you have Germans, you have Austrians, you have Hungarians, you have Czechs, so they get Czechoslovakia. Poland becomes a country again. Basically, the Allies, being influenced heavily by Woodrow Wilson, the American president, say the native peoples of these groups should have their own country and determine their own future. They don't do that with Yugoslavia because they don't want to have a Slovakia, Slovenia. They don't want to have what we kind of have now. And Czechoslovakia becomes its own country. Poland becomes independent again. But it's kind of their idea at the end of the war. So Austria-Hungary just kind of falls apart. And then you have Austria and you have Hungary and all of that. Please settle a long-wage debate on who first discovered America. Okay, that's a tough one. Obviously, the Native Americans. You have the Vikings showing up. When you think about sustained European contact and sustained knowledge of the New World in the Old World, which includes Asia as well as India, Africa, and Europe, Columbus, because there's sustained contact and there's a sustained connection, and the Old World is never going to be kind of on its own again after that. I'm not saying what Columbus did was good. I'm just saying what happened. Yeah, that's very funny. To be fair, with the UN and the United States, there hasn't really been anything close to World War II since then. We have a Cold War, but there hasn't been another world global conflict. And a lot of people have thought that the proliferation of nuclear weapons has deterred people from huge land wars when nukes are on the table. That's what President Eisenhower thought. He thought that if the United States could build up a bunch of nuclear weapons, they could use those nuclear weapons to keep the Soviets from attacking them. Japan just comes out of nowhere. Japan had been shut off from the West for hundreds of years, except, I think, the Dutch. They allowed the Dutch to trade with them. After being open during the 15 and 1600s, the Japanese, under the Tokugawa shogunate, shut their doors, and then the Americans show up 200 years later and say, open them or else, and with a giant fleet of ironclad warships, the Japanese basically say, okay, we'll start trading with you. And the Japanese realize under their Emperor Meiji that if they don't become like the West, they will be controlled by the West, kind of like China is at this time. And so they industrialize rapidly, they build a modern army, and by the beginning of the 20th century, they become a real imperial threat. They do very well in World War I, they crush the Russians in the Russo-Japanese War, and they get a sphere of influence in China along with Germany, France, the United States, and Russia before World War I. So, Japan Unit 173, I don't know what that is. There's a lot I don't know. You guys always tell me something that I don't know at least once every week, and I go and I learn about it, and I'm really fascinated. Okay. Catherine the Great. Probably Russia's greatest or second greatest ruler, maybe the greatest female monarch of all time, and definitely one of the greatest monarchs ever. Basically, gets Russia control of the Black Sea, pushes education, basically brings Russia, like many Russian rulers have done in many ways, right up to par with the Western countries, Britain, France, Italy, places like that, but not, and maybe surpasses them a little bit. By the beginning of 1800s, Russia, because it's so vast and has such a large army, is considered the best in the world. Napoleon kind of thwarts that, but then he's thwarted by the Russians. Catherine the Great is the reason Russia is so powerful in the 19th century and at the end of the 1700s. Yeah, there's one dynasty after another in Chinese history. And kind of similar to what I was talking about earlier, one empire follows another. One of the reasons I'm not super obsessed with the fall of the Roman Empire is because one empire just follows another. That's the story of ancient history. You have the Babylonians, followed by the Persians, and they're not the first Babylonians, they're the Neo-Babylonians, followed by the Persians, followed by the Greeks, which divide up after Alexander the Great dies. Then you have the Romans, and then some would argue the Catholic Church is an empire over Europe in the Middle Ages. And the Eastern Roman Empire is still around. And then they fall to the Muslims, the Ottomans. And then all of a sudden, by the time the Ottomans are ready to fall, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, they all have their own individual empires. And when their empires start to falter, many would say the American empire is there to take their place. So you could say that history is just a series of empires. And obviously, going way back, maybe the first real empire, although it'd be hard to call it this, obviously the pharaohs of Egypt. The Chens, when they held a theater hostage. I don't know about that. Again, another thing I would have to research. Hello, welcome. Thank you for coming. If you like the content, be sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. I know we're getting close to an hour, but I'm gonna answer every single question I can find here. Not many people would fight for their own country. Yeah, there's a lot of lack of commitment by a lot of people. Hungary lost 2/3 of their land in the treaty. Yeah, Hungary lost a lot of land, basically, and they kind of had been controlled by the Austrians for a long time and told what to do. The Habsburgs really had put a stranglehold on them. Anyways, thank you. I really appreciate all the support and you guys liking the stream. Yes, they did allow the Chinese to trade with them. They like to trade. Japan and China have always had this kind of love-hate relationship. China has tried to conquer Japan on several occasions and vice versa. Japan's name, language, and poetry all come from China. Very interesting. Unit 731. Gonna have to look at that. What empires do we have today? I don't know if we necessarily have empires. You could argue the Americans are an empire. Oswald Spengler. Who is Oswald Spengler? Name sounds a little familiar. I wouldn't call the Holy Roman Empire the true successor to Rome because I wouldn't call it Holy Roman or an empire. I'm going to go with Voltaire there. I've talked about this before on the channel. Charlemagne, I've got a couple of videos on it. Charlemagne is definitely an emperor, a holy emperor, and he's called the King of the Romans. And at first, the Holy Roman Emperors, which that's modern day Germany, by the way, for those of you who don't know, they're really powerful, they're really influential, but they're not really, they lose a lot of influence over the Pope. And as Germany is kind of really divided, there is no real Germany. As time goes on, they start to elect their emperors. And by the 1600s, the Holy Roman Emperors have very limited power. They have their own provinces, like Charles V, who was the Holy Roman Emperor during the time of the Reformation. He had his own things going on. He was a Habsburg, he was the Emperor of Austria, and he was the King of Spain. And he's actually the King of Spain when Cortez and Pizarro are destroying the Aztecs and the Incans, respectively, and building an empire in the New World. And so the Holy Roman Empire is not, by the 1500s, 1400s, it's German. The emperors don't have any real power, and the church doesn't control it because it's suddenly divided by Protestants and Catholics. What is my favorite country? Oh, well, it's hard to pick because historically I've mentioned Russia as the one I know the most about and I've studied the most, but definitely I like a lot of different ones. It's hard to pick. Let me see here. I would love if you guys come back tomorrow. That would be really great. Noon Pacific, 3 p.m. Eastern, and 9 p.m. in London. I've had some people from Sweden, Finland, Iran, India. Some guy said he couldn't sleep in India, so he was listening to me. And like most historians do, I put him right to sleep. So that was very good. Russia is the true successor to Rome. I don't know about that. Let's see here. Okay, Chechnya, 2001, held hostages in Russia. Yeah, I know a little bit about that. I would like to learn more about that. That would be very, very interesting. Um, let's see, anything else? Yeah, interest. Yeah, Germany was a catalyst, and you could because the German barbaric tribes could never be defeated. The Romans could subdue the Celts, the Gallic peoples, and other groups, but the German barbarians who swept across the Roman Empire could not really truly be defeated. Show us your guns. Uh, if you're talking about material Second Amendment like guns, I don't have any. If you're talking about biceps, again, don't have any. Um, So, do you know the history of Islam in Saudi Arabia? A little bit. Obviously, I know a lot about the history of Islam. Islam is started in modern day Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is called Saudi Arabia because of a Saud family that created the monarchy that rules over Saudi Arabia to this day. Basically, the Saudis, or I should say the Arabs, fight with the British during World War One. Again, you have a world war, you have fighting in the Middle East to help undermine the Ottoman Empire. And the British send a bunch of different officers to tell the Arabs, you will have your own independence after this is over, and you will have your own land, and the Ottomans will never bother you again. The British were lying, but they sent one of the most famous people in all of history, T.E. Lawrence, Lawrence of Arabia, to help them out. And Lawrence becomes extraordinarily sympathetic to their plot, to their plight, and what's going on. And he tries to sue for them to get their own independent country. And the British at first basically try to create a mandate over Saudi Arabia. It doesn't work. Saudi Arabia is one of the only areas in the world that has never truly been colonized by another power, except if you want to call the Ottomans colonizers, you would say them. And by the 1930s, the Saudis, the Saud family, I think it's the 30s or the 40s, the Saud family takes over and creates a monarchy in Saudi Arabia. Um, so please speak about the Northern Crusades. Which Crusades are those? Because there's lots of different crusades. People only think about the crusades as being the Muslims being attacked by the Christians, and those are the major ones. And there's four major ones that we know about in history, and only the first one is really successful. But there are a bunch of other crusades to the Holy Land that don't go well, and there's a lot of crusades in Europe to push out different heretical groups. The church mobilizes, like against the Albigensians, the Cathar heretics in modern day Switzerland. The Reconquista, which is how Spain kicks the Muslims out. The Muslims had controlled Spain for 7 centuries. They kicked them out by the 1400s. The Reconquista, that's a series of crusades. Um, the Children's Crusade, that one is sad but highly overblown. That was never getting anywhere. That was never approved by the church, and it wasn't gonna happen basically. Nordic and Eastern European. Yeah, there's a few of those targeted against non-Catholics. And the Fourth Crusade, interestingly enough, the Crusade started as a way to help the Byzantines, who were not Catholic; they were Eastern Orthodox. Um, but by the Fourth Crusade, the Crusaders have turned their attention on the Byzantines, and before they can get to the Muslim lands, they actually take over the city of Constantinople and kick out the Byzantines for a while. They create a Latin kingdom in Constantinople for a few decades. Um, yeah, Russia's got a lot of interesting history. I don't blame you for being really interested in it. Russia or Canada? Historically speaking, I know a lot more about Russia. I'm a lot more interested historically in Russia. I know a few things about Canada. Both are beautiful. Both are very cold. Um, who do you think should have power over Alaska, USA? Yeah. A lot of people don't know this about American history. The lands that America either conquered or occupied, now this is not saying anything about the Native Americans and the fact that they were dispossessed, which was awful, but a lot of those lands that were taken were bought. So the Americans win this huge war against Mexico. They take over the southwestern part of the United States and California, and they actually buy the land. They pay the Mexicans for the land, and they actually take over all of Mexico, and they give half of Mexico back. And then they buy Alaska. I think $7 million from the Russians, who really just don't have any need for it anymore. So if you buy it, it's yours. That's my opinion there. Um, I meant over American, Canada, or Russia. Who should have power? Oh, America. Again, they bought it. They should control it. It's their land. If it's attacked, that's an invasion. How is it to leave in California? Hello, welcome. Live. California is a beautiful state. It's got problems, but it's always kind of been this sunshine destination, promising a lot of gold and reward for those who go there, whether it's Hollywood, the gold rush that brought the first immigrants here, or the glitz and glamour that it is now well known for. Okay, thank you. Yeah, was it 600,000 and then it was $7 million in inflation? I don't know if it was if that's adjusted. Yeah, the Russians needed the money because they've been bankrupted by the Crimean War, and the Tsar really had no desire to build foreign colonies. And so the Russians needed their money. They were going to build railroads. They were going to industrialize. They were going to try to catch up to the Europeans because once again they had fallen behind. And so Tsar Alexander II thought it would be good for them to have the money. The U.S. thought it was a terrible idea. The newspapers ridiculed President Johnson and Secretary of State William Seward. They called it Seward's folly. But when gold was discovered, along with timber, and now, of course, oil, liquid gold, black gold, it's become huge for the United States. I appreciate that. Okay, let's see. Lipster, is that me? Thank you for subbing. I really appreciate it. Yeah, it was really hard. And you've got a lot of people coming from Ireland and a lot of people coming from Ireland and Germany, settling in America in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, and then going out to California. A lot of the people who come directly to California are immigrants from China. And they come in large numbers in the 1840s and then again in the 1860s, because even though the gold rush is over, there's this pull to bring in Chinese immigrants to build the Transcontinental Railroad. And they ask why them, and a lot of the people who want that say they built the Great Wall of China, they can build the Transcontinental Railroad. Thank you for subscribing, really appreciate it. And to be fair, it was fought useless. Okay. I guess I'm Lipster. I've been called, people have commented on my lips a lot, and most of them have been good, so I appreciate that. Anyways, I don't see any more questions. I think I've answered anything else. Gobeki Tepe. Again, I've heard several things. The Chechenian thing, Gobeki Tepe, I'm not sure, and Oscar Spengler, which I really want to learn more about. So, how is it for an immigrant to come to California in 2025? I don't know. There are a lot of immigrants in California, most of them coming from Central and South America across the southern border. And again, California kind of promises this golden life, and it's difficult and it's hard and it's an adjustment, like it has been for immigrants throughout American history. They show up in America thinking it's the land paved with golden roads and streets, and it isn't that way. But generally speaking, life is a lot better, and there's very little repatriation. Okay. All right. Thank you, everyone, for coming. I'm going to wrap it up at this point. We've been going for a long time. We went over a few minutes, but I really appreciate all the questions and good discussion. It's always great to have you all here. I will be back. Thank you. I really appreciate that. Great to have subscribers. Great to have you all along. I will see you again tomorrow, 3 Eastern, 9 p.m. Paris time. Shout out to the Olympics. Shout out to all of you great people. Make sure to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel out. 3 Eastern tomorrow for our special back-to-back Labor Day 2 live streams for the first time on the Friendly Neighborhood History channel. I have really enjoyed this discussion, and I look forward to seeing you all tomorrow. Have a great day. Bye-bye.